The text message that destroyed my $200 million career arrived at exactly 11:47 a.m. on a Thursday, 30 minutes before I was supposed to close the largest defense contractor merger in corporate history. But what that Silicon Valley tech bro didn't know when he fired me via SMS was that I'd already spent 6 months building a relationship with his biggest rival, and I was about to hand them a $2.3 billion victory on a silver platter. I should have seen it coming, but when you're juggling 16-hour days and flying between 3 time zones every week, you miss the warning signs. My name is Captain Sarah Chen, though most people in the boardrooms of Manhattan just called me Chen. The military rank felt outdated in my Armani suits and corner office meetings, but it never really left my voice. 8 years in Army intelligence taught me to read people, to spot the lies hiding behind polished presentations, and to execute strategies that others couldn't even comprehend. What the military hadn't taught me was how to navigate the particular brand of betrayal that comes with a Harvard MBA and a trust fund. The morning started like any other in my world of high-stakes corporate mergers. I was sitting in the driver's seat of my Tesla Model S, parked outside the glass towers of Meridian Defense Solutions in downtown Seattle, watching the rain streak down my windshield while I reviewed the final contract terms one last time. 27 months of my life had gone into orchestrating this deal. 27 months of due diligence, regulatory filings, stakeholder meetings, and delicate negotiations between 2 companies that had been rivals for over 3 decades. Meridian Defense Solutions was acquiring Titan Aerospace Technologies in what would become the 3rd largest defense merger in U.S. history. The combined entity would control 43% of the military drone market and hold contracts worth over $8.7 billion with the Department of Defense. I had structured every aspect of this deal, from the initial valuation models to the complex regulatory approval process that had taken us through 14 different government agencies. My phone buzzed against the leather seat beside me. I glanced down, expecting to see another message from Patricia Hawkins, Meridian's CEO, confirming the final details. Instead, I saw a text from my own boss, Marcus Webb, the 34-year-old wunderkind who'd somehow convinced the board of Blackstone Capital Partners that his Stanford connections and venture capital background made him qualified to lead their mergers and acquisitions division. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Meeting canceled. You're terminated effective immediately. Don't sign anything. Return company property by 5 p.m. I stared at the screen for a full 30 seconds, my brain trying to process the words, terminated, via text message. 30 minutes before closing a $2.3 billion deal that would generate over $47 million in fees for Blackstone. My hands didn't shake. That was the military training. In Army intelligence, when everything goes sideways, you don't have the luxury of emotional reactions. You assess the situation, identify your assets, and execute a new plan. But sitting in that car, with the Seattle skyline blurred by rain and the weight of 2 years of work dissolving in a 30-word text message, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my deployment in Afghanistan. The cold, calculating anger that comes when someone underestimates what you're capable of. I had built my reputation on being unshakable. During my military service, I'd been the one they sent when negotiations needed someone who could think 3 moves ahead while keeping a poker face. In the corporate world, that same skill set had made me the go-to specialist for deals that other investment bankers considered too complex or politically sensitive. I'd closed 47 major transactions in 5 years, generating over $200 million in fees for my employers. The Meridian Titan merger was supposed to be my masterpiece. I'd identified the opportunity 18 months ago when both companies were struggling with cost overruns on their respective Pentagon contracts. Titan had the innovative technology but lacked the manufacturing infrastructure. Meridian had the production capabilities but was falling behind in R&D. The synergies were obvious to anyone who understood the defense industry, but executing the deal required navigating a maze of regulatory requirements, national security, concerns, and egos that had been clashing since the 1990s. I had spent countless weekends flying between Seattle and San Diego, building relationships with executives who initially saw me as just another suit from Wall Street. It took months to earn their trust, to prove that I understood their business beyond the financial statements. I'd toured manufacturing facilities, sat through technical briefings on classified projects, and even spent a week at a military base in Nevada, watching their drones operate in simulated combat scenarios. The breakthrough came 7 months ago, during a dinner meeting with Patricia Hawkins and James Morrison, Titan's CEO. We were at a private dining room in the Four Seasons in San Francisco, and the conversation had stalled over intellectual property concerns. Both companies had developed proprietary technologies that they were reluctant to share, even in a merger scenario. I excused myself from the table and spent 20 minutes in the bathroom, not because I needed to, but because I needed to think. When I returned, I had a solution that neither of their legal teams had considered. A tiered integration structure that would allow both companies to maintain separate R&D divisions for the first 2 years post-merger, with a gradual integration process tied to specific performance milestones. Patricia leaned back in her chair and smiled for the first time that evening. "Captain, I think you just saved this deal." That nickname stuck, even after I'd explained that I preferred to leave my military rank in the past. Both CEOs continued calling me Captain. It became a term of respect, a recognition that I brought something different to the table than the typical investment banker with their spreadsheets and PowerPoint presentations. The due diligence process revealed even more opportunities than I'd initially projected. Meridian's manufacturing efficiency could reduce Titan's production costs by 38%. Titan's advanced AI systems could enhance Meridian's existing product line, potentially opening up markets worth over $2 billion in the next 5 years. The combined company would have the scale to compete for the Pentagon's next-generation fighter drone program, a contract worth potentially $15 billion over 10 years. I documented every detail, built financial models that accounted for dozens of variables, and created presentation materials that even the most skeptical board members couldn't argue with. The regulatory approval process alone required over 400 pages of documentation that I personally reviewed and refined. I'd worked with attorneys from 4 different law firms, consulted with former Pentagon officials, and even brought in a retired Air Force general to validate our national security assessments. Marcus had been absent for most of this process. He'd show up for the high-profile meetings, the ones where photos might be taken or industry publications might be watching, but the actual work fell to me. I didn't mind. I preferred it that way. Marcus had a tendency to oversimplify complex issues, to make promises to clients that he didn't fully understand the implications of. 3 weeks ago, I'd noticed a shift in his behavior. He started asking more detailed questions about the deal structure, requesting copies of documents he'd never shown interest in before. He began scheduling one-on-one meetings with Patricia and James, calls that I wasn't invited to join. When I asked about these conversations, he'd wave them off as relationship maintenance or high-level strategic discussions. I should have recognized the signs. In the military, we called it positioning for credit. It happens when someone realizes that a mission is going to be successful, and they want to ensure their name is associated with the victory. Marcus had spent 2 years treating the Meridian Titan deal as a secondary priority, something he could delegate to his capable lieutenant. Now, with the finish line in sight and industry publications already drafting articles about the transaction, he wanted to be recognized as the architect of the deal. But firing me 30 minutes before closing? That was a level of ruthlessness I hadn't anticipated, even from Marcus. I sat in my car for another 5 minutes, watching the rain and thinking through my options. I could walk away, return my company laptop and phone, and start looking for another position. With my track record, I'd have multiple offers within a week. I could also fight the termination, though without an employment contract or documented cause for dismissal, my legal options were limited. Or I could do something that Marcus had never seen coming, something that would demonstrate exactly why you should never underestimate a former Army intelligence officer who'd spent 2 years building relationships that went far deeper than corporate hierarchy. I started the car and drove toward the Meridian building, my mind already 3 steps ahead. Marcus had made his move, but he'd forgotten a critical detail. The contracts weren't signed yet, and in the world of high-stakes mergers, possession of client relationships matters more than company letterhead. The security guard in the Meridian lobby recognized me immediately. "Good morning, Captain. Mrs. Hawkins is expecting you in the executive conference room." I smiled and headed toward the elevators, my phone already buzzing with a new message. This time, it wasn't from Marcus. It was from David Park, CEO of North Star Dynamics, Blackstone's biggest rival in the defense industry M&A space. We'd worked together on a smaller deal 8 months ago, before I'd joined Blackstone, and he'd made it clear that his firm would be interested in recruiting me when my non-compete clause expired. "Heard through the grapevine there might be some changes in your situation. Coffee this afternoon? I have a proposition that might interest you." The elevator doors opened on the 40th floor, and I stepped into what I knew would be the last act of my career at Blackstone Capital Partners. But it wouldn't be the end of my story. It would be the beginning of something much more interesting. The first crack in my perfect corporate facade had actually appeared 3 weeks earlier, though I dismissed it at the time as Marcus simply trying to insert himself into the final stages of the deal. I was reviewing quarterly performance metrics in my office when I noticed something odd in the client communication logs. Marcus had scheduled 4 separate calls with Patricia Hawkins and James Morrison over the past 2 weeks, all marked as strategic alignment meetings in the system. What struck me as unusual wasn't just the frequency, but the timing. These calls were happening during hours when I was typically in other meetings or traveling between client sites. It felt deliberate, calculated in a way that made my military-trained instincts prickle with unease. In Army intelligence, we learned to pay attention to patterns that seemed just slightly off-kilter, because those patterns often revealed someone's true intentions long before they were ready to show their hand. I'd tried to bring it up casually during our weekly team meeting. "I noticed you've been having some additional touchpoints with the Meridian leadership team," I said, keeping my tone neutral and professional. "Anything I should be aware of for the closing process?" Marcus had given me that practiced smile, the one he'd perfected during his MBA program at Stanford. "Just making sure all the relationships are solid at the executive level. You know how these CEOs can get nervous right before closing. They want to hear from the senior partner that everything's on track." Senior partner. The phrase hung in the air between us like a warning shot. Marcus was only 2 years older than me, and while he technically outranked me in Blackstone's hierarchy, we both knew that I had more experience with complex defense industry transactions. His expertise lay in tech startups and venture capital deals, not the intricate world of government contractors and Pentagon politics. But I'd let it slide, chalking it up to typical executive posturing. That was my first mistake. The second red flag came during a conference call with Titan's legal team. We were discussing final regulatory approvals, and Marcus made a comment about my approach to structuring the intellectual property provisions. My approach. I'd spent 6 weeks developing those provisions, working directly with patent attorneys and technology transfer specialists to create a framework that would satisfy both companies' concerns about sharing proprietary information. Jennifer Walsh, Titan's general counsel, had looked confused for a moment. "Marcus, I thought those provisions came from Captain Chen's analysis of the competitive landscape. She's the one who identified the potential conflicts and proposed the tiered integration solution." Marcus had smoothly redirected the conversation, but not before I caught the slight tightening around his eyes. He was rewriting the narrative of who had done what, and he was doing it systematically. The third warning sign should have been impossible to miss, but I was so focused on the technical details of closing that I almost overlooked it entirely. I was working late in the office, around 9:30 on a Tuesday evening, when I overheard Marcus on a phone call in his corner office. His door was slightly ajar, and his voice carried down the hallway with that particular intensity that people use when they think they're having a private conversation. "No, I understand the timeline pressure," he was saying, "but you have to. Trust me on this." Chen's been invaluable for the execution phase, but when it comes to the relationship management and long-term client development, that's where my background really adds value. These defense contractors respond to a certain type of leadership presence. I'd frozen in place, pretending to review documents while straining to hear more of the conversation. "The deal closes in 3 weeks," Marcus continued. "After that, the client relationship transitions to ongoing advisory services. That's a $12 million annual retainer, and frankly, it needs someone with more senior-level credibility managing it. Senior-level credibility. The phrase felt like a slap across the face. I'd been managing relationships with Fortune 500 CEOs since before Marcus had graduated from business school. I'd negotiated contracts with Pentagon officials who had more stars on their shoulders than Marcus had years of work experience. But somehow, in his mind, my military background and proven track record couldn't compete with his Ivy League pedigree and venture capital connections. I'd stayed in the office until almost midnight that night, not because I had work to finish, but because I needed time to process what I'd heard. The rational part of my brain told me to confront Marcus directly, to have an honest conversation about roles and expectations. The military part of my brain, the part that had kept me alive during 2 deployments, was telling me to gather more intelligence before making any moves. Over the next week, I started paying closer attention to the subtle shifts in office dynamics. Marcus began copied on email threads that he'd never been involved in before. Support staff started referring questions to him that they'd previously brought directly to me. Most tellingly, I noticed that my access to certain client files had been restricted, requiring additional approval steps that hadn't existed before. When I asked our IT administrator about the access changes, she looked uncomfortable. "New security protocols," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. Marcus wanted tighter controls on sensitive deal documents as we get closer to closing. Tighter controls. Translation: Marcus was limiting my ability to independently manage client relationships and deal documentation. He was systematically isolating me from the very work I'd been leading for over 2 years. The final warning came during what should have been a routine status meeting with Patricia Hawkins. We were discussing post-merger integration timelines, and Patricia made a comment about looking forward to continuing to work with Marcus and his team on the transition planning. His team, not our team, not the Blackstone team. His team. I'd felt something cold settle in my stomach, but I'd maintained my professional composure. "Of course," I'd said, "we're all committed to ensuring a smooth transition process." But after the call ended, I'd sat in my office staring at my computer screen, finally understanding what was happening. Marcus wasn't just trying to take credit for my work. He was positioning himself to take over the entire client relationship, relegating me to a supporting role or potentially pushing me out entirely. The realization hit me like a tactical briefing that suddenly makes sense of scattered intelligence reports. Marcus had been executing a carefully planned campaign to undermine my position while simultaneously strengthening his own. Every additional client call, every reframed conversation about deal structure, every subtle change in how colleagues interacted with me, it was all part of a systematic effort to reposition himself as the primary relationship manager for what would become Blackstone's most lucrative defense industry client. In the military, we had a term for this kind of maneuvering: mission creep. It's when someone gradually expands their role and authority until they've effectively taken control of an operation that originally belonged to someone else. The dangerous thing about mission creep is that it happens slowly enough that the original mission leader often doesn't realize what's happening until it's too late to counter it effectively. But Marcus had made one critical miscalculation. He'd assumed that I would react the way most corporate professionals do when they sense their position being undermined, with anxiety, defensiveness, or attempts to curry favor with senior management. He didn't understand that my military background had taught me a different approach to handling threats. In Army intelligence, when you identify an adversary who's positioning against you, you don't panic or confront them directly. You gather information, assess their capabilities and weaknesses, and develop multiple contingency plans. Most importantly, you never let them know that you've figured out their strategy until you're ready to implement your counter-strategy. So I'd started doing exactly that. I began documenting every interaction, every email, every subtle shift in how Marcus was positioning himself relative to the Meridian Titan deal. I created backup copies of all my work product, stored on personal devices that couldn't be accessed through company systems. I also started reaching out to my broader professional network, having casual conversations with former colleagues and industry contacts about potential opportunities. Most significantly, I'd begun strengthening my direct relationships with both Patricia Hawkins and James Morrison, making sure that they understood the depth of my involvement in structuring their deal and my commitment to ensuring its success. I didn't badmouth Marcus or create drama, but I made sure that both CEOs knew they could reach me directly if they had concerns or questions about any aspect of the transaction. What I hadn't anticipated was how quickly Marcus would move from subtle undermining to outright elimination. The text message firing me 30 minutes before closing wasn't just ruthless, it was strategically brilliant in its timing. By waiting until the very last moment, Marcus ensured that I wouldn't have time to build support within Blackstone's senior management, or to create complications that might delay the deal closing. But his timing also created an opportunity that he hadn't considered. With the contracts unsigned and my relationships with both CEOs still intact, I had a window to implement a contingency plan that would turn his calculated betrayal into the biggest strategic miscalculation of his career. As I sat in my Tesla outside the Meridian building, reviewing David Park's text message about a potential meeting, I realized that Marcus had just handed me the perfect opportunity to demonstrate exactly why you should never underestimate a former intelligence officer who's spent 2 years building relationships that run deeper than corporate hierarchy charts. The pattern of being overlooked and undervalued hadn't started with Marcus Webb. It was a familiar rhythm that had been playing in the background of my career for years. A slow drumbeat of dismissal disguised as professional courtesy. As I sat in my car outside the Meridian building, the memories came flooding back with sharp clarity, each incident a perfectly preserved snapshot of moments when my capabilities had been systematically minimized by men who couldn't see past their own assumptions. The first time it happened, I was still transitioning out of the military. I'd landed what seemed like a dream position at Goldman Sachs, working in their defense and aerospace division. My commanding officer had personally recommended me to the managing director, emphasizing my strategic planning experience and my deep understanding of Pentagon procurement processes. I thought my military background would be an asset, a differentiator that would help me build credibility with clients who operated in the same world I'd just left. Instead, it became a liability that followed me into every meeting like an unwelcome shadow. Richard Steinberg, the division head, had a particular way of introducing me to clients. This is Sarah Chen, one of our analysts. She has some interesting insights from her military service. Analyst. Not associate, not specialist, analyst. The entry-level designation that typically applied to recent MBA graduates with no real-world experience. I had 8 years of strategic planning experience, including classified projects that involved budget allocations larger than most corporate acquisitions, but somehow that translated to interesting insights rather than relevant expertise. The most infuriating part was how Richard would consistently redirect conversations when I tried to contribute substantive analysis. During a meeting with Lockheed Martin's CFO, I'd identified a potential issue with their satellite division's revenue projections based on my knowledge of classified military satellite programs. Instead of letting me explain the implications, Richard had jumped in with, "Sarah raises an interesting point, but let me put it in the broader context of market dynamics." Market dynamics. As if my understanding of actual Pentagon decision-making processes was somehow less relevant than his theoretical knowledge of defense industry trends. The pattern continued for 18 months. I'd prepare detailed analyses, identify strategic opportunities, and develop client recommendations that consistently proved accurate. But when it came time for client presentations or senior leadership meetings, Richard would present my work as supporting research for his strategic vision. My name appeared in footnotes and acknowledgments, never in the executive summary or key findings sections. The breaking point came during the annual performance review cycle. I'd generated over $15 million in fees for the division, more than any other first-year associate in the company's history. My client feedback scores were consistently in the top 5%. I'd even received a personal commendation letter from a Pentagon acquisition director for helping structure a deal that saved the Department of Defense over $200 million, Richard's assessment. Sarah shows promise as an analyst, but she needs to develop more polish in client-facing situations. Her military background sometimes comes across as too direct for the nuanced relationship management that our clients expect. Too direct. Translation. I didn't smile enough when men interrupted me or dismissed my recommendations. I didn't defer appropriately to senior colleagues who had less relevant experience but more prestigious educational backgrounds. I didn't perform the elaborate dance of self-deprecation that seemed to be required of women in investment banking. Left Goldman Sachs after 2 years, not because I couldn't handle the work or the pressure, but because I refused to spend my career watching other people take credit for my strategic thinking while simultaneously being told that I wasn't quite ready for the responsibilities I was already handling. The second major disappointment came at J.P. Morgan, where I joined their infrastructure finance team with explicit promises about advancement opportunities and client relationship ownership. The hiring manager, David Martinez, had specifically recruited me because of my defense industry expertise and my track record of closing complex deals. "We need someone who can navigate the regulatory environment and build relationships with government clients," he'd told me during the interview process. "Your background is exactly what we're looking for to expand our presence in the defense sector." For the first 6 months, everything seemed to align with those promises. I was given primary responsibility for developing new business with mid-sized defense contractors, and I successfully brought in 3 new clients with combined assets worth over $800 million. I'd also identified a potential acquisition opportunity that could have generated $25 million in fees for the bank. Then David hired Bradley Morrison, a former McKinsey consultant with an MBA from Wharton and connections throughout the private equity community. Bradley had never worked with defense contractors, had no understanding of military procurement processes, and couldn't explain the difference between a cost-plus and fixed-price contract if his bonus depended on it. But Bradley had something I apparently lacked: the right kind of network. Within 3 months of Bradley's arrival, I found myself relegated to supporting roles on deals I'd originated. David's explanation was always framed in terms of leveraging everyone's strengths and optimizing client coverage models. In practice, it meant that I did the analytical work and relationship building, while Bradley presented the recommendations and took credit for the strategic insights. The most galling example came during a pitch to Raytheon for a $400 million refinancing deal. I'd spent weeks developing a financing structure that would save them over $18 million in interest payments while providing more favorable covenant terms than their existing credit facility. The presentation materials included detailed cash flow projections, regulatory compliance analysis, and risk mitigation strategies that drew directly from my understanding of Pentagon budget cycles and defense industry dynamics. Bradley presented my work to Raytheon's board of directors without mentioning my involvement. When the CFO asked a technical question about military contract accounting standards, Bradley stumbled through a non-answer before promising to circle back with more detailed analysis from our team. After the meeting, David pulled me aside with what he clearly thought was good news. "Great work on the background research, Sarah. Bradley mentioned how helpful your input was in preparing for the presentation." Background research. 2 months of strategic analysis and relationship development had been reduced to background research. My expertise in the very industry we were trying to serve had become a supporting function for someone who couldn't spell DFARS without Google assistance. I stayed at J.P. Morgan for another year, primarily because I needed the experience and credentials to make my next career move. But I documented every instance of marginalization, every meeting where my contributions were minimized or redistributed. I also began building relationships outside the bank's formal hierarchy, connecting directly with clients and industry contacts who appreciated my knowledge and approach. When I finally left J.P. Morgan, 3 of my clients specifically asked about following my career and potentially working with me at my next firm. That should have been a clear signal about where the real value and relationships lay, but David seemed genuinely surprised that clients would want to maintain connections with someone he'd consistently treated as a junior support person. The third and most sophisticated example of professional undermining happened at Deutsche Bank, where I joined as a vice president in their mergers and acquisitions group. This was supposed to be my breakthrough opportunity, a senior role with direct client responsibility and a clear path to managing director. The division head, Michael Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, had recruited me specifically to lead their expansion into defense industry M&A. Unlike my previous employers, Michael seemed to genuinely understand and value my expertise. He gave me significant autonomy, substantial deal flow, and explicit promises about partnership track advancement. For 2 years, everything worked exactly as promised. I closed 7 major transactions, including a $1.2 billion acquisition that generated over $18 million in fees for the bank. Industry publications began recognizing me as one of the leading experts in defense sector M&A. I was invited to speak at conferences, quoted in trade journals, and approached by executive recruiters from competing firms. Then Michael announced his retirement, and the bank promoted Thomas Wright to replace him. Thomas had spent his entire career in consumer goods and retail M&A. He'd never worked on a defense deal, had no relationships in the industry, and seemed to view my expertise as a threat rather than an asset. His approach to management was to centralize all client relationships through his office, ostensibly to ensure consistent messaging and strategic alignment across all transactions. The change was immediate and devastating. Clients who had worked directly with me for months suddenly found themselves redirected to Thomas for senior-level strategic discussions. Deal teams that I'd been leading were restructured with Thomas as the primary client contact. Most insidiously, Thomas began requiring all client communications to be pre-approved through his office, effectively preventing me from maintaining the direct relationships that had made my deals successful. When I tried to discuss these changes with Thomas directly, he employed the most sophisticated version of professional gaslighting I'd ever encountered. "Sarah, I think there might be some misunderstanding about the organizational structure here. As division head, I need to maintain oversight of all major client relationships. That doesn't diminish your valuable contributions to deal execution. It just ensures that we're presenting a unified senior leadership presence to our most important clients." Unified senior leadership presence. The implication was clear. Regardless of my expertise or track record, I would never be considered senior leadership in Thomas's organization. The final straw came during a pitch to Boeing for a $2.8 billion spin-off transaction. I'd spent 4 months developing the strategic rationale, financial models, and execution timeline for separating their satellite communications division into a standalone company. The deal structure was incredibly complex, involving regulatory approvals from both civilian and military agencies, international joint venture partnerships, and technology transfer restrictions that required deep understanding of national security. Protocols. Thomas presented my entire strategy to Boeing's board without mentioning my involvement. When the board members asked detailed questions about regulatory processes and military contracting implications, Thomas couldn't provide adequate answers. The pitch failed, and Boeing ultimately hired Goldman Sachs to manage the transaction. Later that week, Thomas called me into his office for what he described as a career development conversation. He'd decided that I was too focused on technical details and needed to develop broader business development skills before I could be considered for senior client responsibilities, too focused on technical details. My deep expertise in the very industry we were supposed to serve had become a limitation rather than an asset. That night, I'd sat in my apartment overlooking Central Park, finally understanding the pattern that had defined my corporate career. It wasn't about competence or results or client relationships. It was about fitting into a predetermined narrative about who deserved credit and recognition for strategic thinking. I'd spent years believing that if I just worked harder, generated better results, and built stronger client relationships, the recognition would eventually follow. But recognition wasn't based on merit. It was based on assumptions about authority that had nothing to do with actual capability or performance. The realization was both devastating and liberating. Devastating, because it meant that everything I'd been working toward was fundamentally flawed. Liberating, because it freed me from the need to keep trying to earn something that was never going to be offered. 6 months later, I joined Blackstone Capital Partners, drawn by Marcus Webb's promises about autonomy, client ownership, and partnership opportunities. I thought I'd finally found an organization that would judge me based on results rather than preconceptions. Sitting in my Tesla outside the Meridian building, reading Marcus's termination text for the 3rd time, I realized that I'd simply encountered the most sophisticated version of the same pattern. Marcus had let me do all the work, build all the relationships, and generate all the results. Then, at the moment of maximum leverage, he'd eliminated me from the equation entirely. But this time, I wasn't going to walk away quietly and start over somewhere else. This time, I had relationships that ran deeper than corporate hierarchy, expertise that couldn't be replicated, and most importantly, a plan that Marcus had never seen coming. The seed of possibility had been planted during what seemed like an ordinary industry conference 6 months earlier, though I hadn't recognized its significance at the time. I was attending the Defense Industry Finance Summit in Washington, D.C., one of those carefully orchestrated networking events where investment bankers, defense contractors, and Pentagon officials gathered to discuss market trends while sizing each other up for potential business opportunities. I'd been scheduled to participate in a panel discussion about regulatory challenges in defense M&A, alongside 3 other investment bankers and a former Assistant Secretary of Defense. The panel was supposed to be a standard industry overview, the kind of safe, predictable conversation that filled conference agendas without revealing anything particularly insightful or controversial. David Park was in the audience that day. At the time, I knew him primarily by reputation, CEO of North Star Dynamics, one of the fastest-growing independent investment banks specializing in defense and aerospace transactions. North Star had built their reputation by taking on deals that larger banks considered too complex or politically sensitive, and they'd developed an impressive track record of successful closings in situations where established firms had failed. What I didn't know was that David had specifically attended the conference to evaluate potential talent for his expanding M&A team. The panel discussion started predictably enough, with each participant offering carefully rehearsed observations about market conditions and regulatory trends. But 20 minutes into the conversation, an audience member asked a question that exposed the gap between theoretical knowledge and practical experience. Given the recent changes in CFIUS review processes, how do you advise clients to structure transactions involving dual-use technologies? The questioner asked. CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, had recently expanded their authority to review transactions that might affect national security, creating new complexities for deals involving companies with both civilian and military applications. My fellow panelists offered generic responses about engaging early with regulatory counsel and ensuring comprehensive compliance documentation, standard advice that any first-year associate could have provided after reading the relevant regulations. When the moderator turned to me, I found myself drawing on experiences that my colleagues couldn't access. The key insight that most advisors miss, I said, is that CFIUS reviews aren't just about regulatory compliance. They're about demonstrating alignment with national security priorities. I've worked on transactions where the technical compliance was perfect, but the deal failed because the strategic rationale didn't resonate with defense policy objectives. I went on to describe a specific case study, carefully avoiding any classified details, where I'd helped restructure a transaction to address CFIUS concerns by reframing the deal's strategic value proposition. The acquiring company had been focused on cost savings and operational synergies, but CFIUS was concerned about maintaining domestic manufacturing capabilities for critical defense components. By restructuring the deal to include specific commitments about U.S. manufacturing investment and workforce retention, we'd transformed a problematic transaction into one that actively supported national security objectives. The audience response was immediate and engaged. Several people took notes, and I noticed multiple participants leaning forward in their chairs. More importantly, the questions that followed were substantive and specific, indicating that I'd provided insights that went beyond the usual conference platitudes. After the panel ended, David approached me during the networking reception. He was younger than I'd expected, probably in his early 40s, with the kind of focused intensity that successful entrepreneurs develop when they're building something from scratch. "Captain Chen," he said, extending his hand. "David Park, North Star, Dynamics." That was an impressive analysis of the CFIUS landscape. You clearly have experience that goes beyond the typical investment banking perspective. I accepted his handshake, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact. Thank you. I try to bring a practitioner's perspective to these discussions rather than just regurgitating regulatory summaries. David smiled. That's exactly what I was hoping to hear. Can I buy you a drink? I'd love to learn more about your background and your approach to defense industry transactions. We found a quiet corner of the hotel bar, away from the main networking crowd. David ordered whiskey neat. I opted for wine, wanting to keep my head clear for what I sensed might be an important conversation. "I've been following your work," David said once we'd settled into our seats. "The aerospace dynamics acquisition you advised on last year. That was elegant deal structuring. Most bankers would have tried to force a standard acquisition model, but you found a way to address the technology transfer restrictions while maintaining the strategic rationale for both parties. I was genuinely surprised. The aerospace dynamics deal had been relatively small by investment banking standards, only $400 million, and it hadn't received much industry attention. The fact that David had not only noticed it but understood the structural innovations I'd implemented suggested a level of market awareness that impressed me. That transaction required thinking beyond conventional M&A frameworks, I replied. The companies involved had complementary capabilities, but the regulatory environment made a standard acquisition impossible. We had to create a structure that achieved the same strategic objectives through a different legal mechanism. David leaned forward slightly. Exactly. And that's the kind of thinking that most investment banks can't provide, because they don't have professionals who understand both the strategic imperatives and the regulatory realities of defense industry transactions. The conversation continued for over an hour, ranging across industry trends, regulatory challenges, and the evolving relationship between defense contractors and their government customers. What struck me most was David's depth of understanding about the defense industry's unique characteristics. Unlike most investment bankers who viewed defense companies as just another client sector, David understood the political, strategic, and technological factors that drove decision-making in this space. The challenge for independent firms like Northstar, David explained, is competing against the established players who have existing relationships and brand recognition. But we've found that there's significant demand for advisors who can provide specialized expertise rather than just generic investment banking services. He paused, studying my expression. The question is whether we can attract the right kind of talent, professionals who have the combination of technical expertise, client relationship skills, and industry credibility that defense contractors are looking for. I understood that he was evaluating me as a potential recruit, but his approach was more sophisticated than the typical headhunter pitch. Instead of making direct offers or promises, he was exploring whether my professional philosophy aligned with Northstar's strategic positioning. What I've learned, I said carefully, is that defense industry clients value advisors who understand their business beyond the financial statements. They want to work with people who can navigate the political complexities, anticipate regulatory challenges, and structure transactions that support their strategic objectives, rather than just maximizing short-term financial returns. David nodded, approvingly. That's been our experience as well. The best defense industry deals are the ones where the advisory team becomes a true strategic partner, rather than just a service provider. As the evening wound down, David handed me his business card. I'd like to continue this conversation when we both have more time. Northstar is expanding our M&A capabilities, and I think there might be opportunities for collaboration, whether that's on specific transactions or something more formal. Something more formal. The implication was clear, but David was too professional to make a direct recruitment pitch during our first conversation. Over the following weeks, David and I exchanged emails about industry developments and regulatory changes. The correspondence was professional and substantive, focusing on market analysis rather than personal career discussions. But I found myself looking forward to his insights and perspectives, which were consistently more thoughtful and nuanced than the typical industry commentary I received from other contacts. 3 months later, when I was dealing with the early signs of Marcus's positioning campaign, David reached out with an invitation to lunch during his next visit to New York. We met at a discreet restaurant in Midtown, the kind of place where business conversations could be conducted without concern about being overheard by competitors or colleagues. I've been thinking about our conversation in Washington, David said after we'd ordered. Northstar is at an inflection point where we need to decide whether to expand our team or continue operating as a boutique firm. The right addition could transform our capabilities and market position. He leaned back in his chair, choosing his words carefully. The challenge is finding someone who has the technical expertise, client relationships, and strategic vision to help us compete at the highest levels of the market. Someone who understands that building a successful independent firm requires a different approach than working within an established institution. I appreciated his directness while maintaining professional boundaries. What would that different approach look like in practice? David smiled. Partnership rather than employment. Equity participation rather than just salary and bonus. Client. Ownership rather than institutional relationship management. The opportunity to build something significant rather than just executing someone else's vision. The conversation continued for 2 hours, covering everything from Northstar's growth strategy to the specific challenges of building an independent platform in a market dominated by established players. What impressed me most was David's long-term thinking and his understanding that successful firms are built on the foundation of strong client relationships rather than just transaction volume. As we prepared to leave, David made his position clear without creating any immediate pressure. Sarah, I think there's an opportunity for us to build something special together. Not necessarily tomorrow, but when the timing is right for both of us. In the meantime, I hope we can continue to share insights and perspectives on market developments. He handed me a second business card, this one with his personal cell phone number written on the back. If you ever find yourself in a situation where you're looking for a different kind of opportunity, I hope you'll give me a call. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. 3 months later, sitting in my Tesla with Marcus's termination text on my phone screen, I realized that David's timing had been prescient. He'd identified the potential for our paths to converge long before I'd understood the vulnerabilities in my position at Blackstone. The seed he'd planted during that conference conversation had grown quietly in the back of my mind, creating possibilities I hadn't fully considered until the moment when those possibilities became necessities. I pulled out David's business card and dialed his personal number. The preparation phase began the moment I ended my phone call with David Park. His response to my situation had been immediate and decisive. "Don't sign anything until we talk. I can be in Seattle by tonight." Within 6 hours, I was sitting across from him in a private dining room at the Four Seasons, watching him review the Meridian Titan deal documents with the focused intensity of a general studying battlefield maps. But the real preparation had started weeks earlier, when my military instincts had finally overruled my corporate optimism, and I'd begun treating Marcus Webb as a potential adversary rather than just a difficult colleague. The Army had taught me that the most dangerous enemies are the ones who smile while they position against you, and Marcus's increasingly frequent strategic alignment meetings with my clients had triggered every tactical alarm I'd developed during 8 years of intelligence work. My first move had been to create what we called operational redundancy in the military, backup systems that couldn't be compromised by enemy action. In corporate terms, that meant ensuring I had independent access to all critical information and relationships, stored in locations that Marcus couldn't control or eliminate. I'd started by methodically copying every document, email, analysis, and presentation related to the Meridian Titan deal onto encrypted external drives, not just the final versions that lived in Blackstone's shared systems, but also the working drafts, preliminary analyses, and detailed notes that documented my thinking process throughout the development of the transaction structure. This wasn't corporate espionage. Everything I copied was work product that I'd personally created, but it was insurance against exactly the kind of situation I now found myself in. The document preservation process had taken 3 weeks to complete properly. I couldn't simply download massive files without triggering IT security protocols, so I'd been careful to copy materials in small batches during normal business hours, mixing legitimate work activities with backup operations. I'd also been strategic about which materials to prioritize, focusing on documents that demonstrated my personal contribution to deal development rather than standard form agreements or generic market analysis. More importantly, I'd begun strengthening my direct relationships with both Patricia Hawkins and James Morrison, the CEOs whose companies were at the center of the merger. These weren't just courtesy calls or status updates. They were substantive conversations about strategic objectives, implementation challenges, and post-merger opportunities that went far beyond the scope of typical investment banker-client interactions. 3 weeks before Marcus's termination text, I'd flown to Seattle specifically to meet with Patricia about integration planning for the combined company's research and development operations. The meeting had been scheduled for 2 hours. We'd talked for 4, diving deep into technical capabilities, personnel decisions, and strategic priorities that would shape the merged entity's competitive position for years to come. "Captain," Patricia had said as our meeting concluded, "I have to tell you, this is the kind of strategic thinking that made us confident about moving forward with this transaction. You understand our business in ways that most financial advisors never do." I'd made sure to document that conversation, along with similar discussions I'd had with James Morrison about manufacturing integration and supply chain optimization. These weren't just relationship-building exercises. They were investments in credibility and trust that would prove invaluable when circumstances forced me to operate independently. The most critical element of my preparation had been establishing alternative channels of communication with both CEOs. During my Seattle meeting with Patricia, I'd mentioned that I maintained a separate email account for confidential client communications, explaining that some discussions required privacy protections that corporate email systems couldn't provide. Given the sensitive nature of some of the regulatory and competitive intelligence we'll be sharing during the integration process, I'd explained, it might be helpful to have a direct communication channel that doesn't go through multiple corporate systems. Patricia had immediately understood the value proposition. Defense contractors were accustomed to compartmentalized communication protocols, and the idea of maintaining secure channels for sensitive discussions was standard practice in their industry. She'd provided me with her personal email address and direct phone number, information that Marcus didn't have access to through Blackstone's client management systems. James Morrison had been even more receptive to establishing direct communication channels. During a dinner meeting in San Diego, he'd expressed frustration with the typical investment banking approach of routing all communications through senior relationship managers, who often lacked the technical knowledge to understand industry-specific concerns. "I've worked with a lot of financial advisors over the years," James had told me, "and most of them treat defense contractors like generic industrial companies. They don't understand the regulatory environment, the technology transfer restrictions, or the political dynamics that drive our strategic decisions. You're different. You actually get how our business works." That conversation had led to James providing me with his personal contact information and explicit permission to reach out directly when I had questions or insights that required immediate attention. By the time Marcus sent his termination text, I had established communication channels with both CEOs that bypassed Blackstone's corporate infrastructure entirely. But relationship management was only part of my preparation strategy. I'd also been conducting what intelligence officers call threat assessment, systematically analyzing Marcus's capabilities, motivations, and likely courses of action. This wasn't paranoia. It was professional due diligence based on observable behavioral patterns. Marcus's background was easier to research than he probably realized. His LinkedIn profile, Stanford alumni directory information, and industry publication interviews provided a detailed picture of his career trajectory and professional relationships. More revealing were the subtle patterns I'd noticed in how he managed other client relationships and deal teams. I'd made a point of talking informally with colleagues who'd worked on Marcus's previous transactions, asking casual questions about deal structure decisions and client management approaches. The picture that emerged was consistent. Marcus was skilled at positioning himself as the senior relationship manager on successful deals while distancing himself from transactions that encountered problems or delays. Jennifer Walsh, a senior associate who'd worked on 3 deals with Marcus, had been particularly illuminating during a coffee conversation that I'd framed as seeking advice about career development. "Marcus is very good at managing up," Jennifer had told me. "He knows how to present results to senior management in ways that highlight his strategic contribution. But he can also be protective of client relationships when deals get close to closing. He tends to centralize communication channels during the final phases. Protective, centralize communication channels." Translation: Marcus had a pattern of marginalizing deal team members when it came time to claim credit for successful transactions. Armed with this intelligence, I'd begun preparing for multiple contingency scenarios. The most likely outcome, I'd assumed, was that Marcus would gradually reduce my client-facing responsibilities while positioning himself as the primary relationship manager for ongoing advisory services. I'd prepared for that scenario by strengthening my direct relationships with both CEOs and documenting my strategic contributions to the deal development process. The second scenario I'd considered was that Marcus might try to remove me from the deal team entirely either through reassignment to other transactions or through performance management processes designed to create justification for termination. I'd prepared for that possibility by creating comprehensive documentation of my work product and by establishing the alternative communication channels with Patricia and James. What I hadn't fully anticipated was the third scenario: immediate termination, designed to eliminate me from the equation entirely while preserving Marcus's position as the sole relationship manager for deal closing and ongoing advisory services. The timing of his termination text, 30 minutes before the scheduled closing, was strategically brilliant in its ruthlessness. But Marcus had made one critical miscalculation in his threat assessment of me. He'd evaluated my likely responses based on typical corporate professional behavior patterns: shock, attempts to negotiate or appeal the decision, or immediate compliance with termination procedures. He hadn't considered that my military background had taught me to prepare for worst-case scenarios and to maintain operational capabilities even when primary systems were compromised. The phone call with David Park had confirmed what I'd suspected about North Star Dynamics' capabilities in strategic positioning. David's firm had the financial resources, industry relationships, and regulatory expertise to execute complex defense industry transactions independently. More importantly, David had expressed consistent interest in expanding North Star's capabilities through strategic talent acquisition. "Sarah," David had said during our phone conversation, "what you're describing isn't just a professional setback. It's an opportunity to demonstrate why independent platforms can deliver superior results compared to bureaucratic institutions. If you're willing to take the risk, I think we can turn Marcus's betrayal into the foundation for something much more significant." By the time I met David at the Four Seasons that evening, I'd already made my decision. The preparation phase was complete. Marcus had eliminated me from Blackstone's organizational structure, but he'd inadvertently freed me to operate with a level of strategic flexibility that his corporate constraints couldn't match. The next phase would require perfect execution, impeccable timing, and absolute confidence in relationships that had been built through months of genuine strategic partnership rather than hierarchical positioning. David spread the Meridian Titan contract documents across the dining table, studying the signature. Pages with the focused attention of someone who understood exactly what we were contemplating. "The legal structure is clean," he said finally. "North Star has the regulatory approvals and financial capacity to serve as the advisor of record. The question is whether you're ready to bet your career on relationships that run deeper than corporate letterhead." I looked at the unsigned contracts, thinking about 2 years of strategic work that Marcus had tried to claim, and about 2 CEOs who valued my expertise enough to establish direct communication channels outside of Blackstone's systems. "David," I said, "I've been preparing for this moment longer than I realized. Let's make the call." The betrayal moment arrived with surgical precision at exactly 11:47 a.m., just as I was reviewing the final signature pages one last time before heading into the Meridian conference room. Marcus's text message appeared on my phone screen like, "A digital assassination. Meeting canceled. You're terminated effective immediately. Don't sign anything. Return company property by 5 p.m. I stared at the words, feeling that familiar cold clarity that had kept me alive during 2 military deployments. This wasn't panic or shock. This was the moment when all the preparation and contingency planning crystallized into perfect focus. Marcus had just made the most catastrophic miscalculation of his career, and he didn't even know it yet. My phone was already ringing. David Park's number flashed on the screen, confirming that he'd been monitoring the situation as we'd planned. "Sarah, are you seeing this?" His voice carried the controlled urgency of someone executing a carefully rehearsed operation. "I'm looking at it right now," I replied, walking toward my Tesla while keeping my voice steady. Marcus just fired me via text message, 30 minutes before closing a $2.3 billion deal that I've been architecting for 2 years. "Perfect timing for us, catastrophic timing for him," David said. "Are you ready to implement our contingency plan?" I was already in my car, driving toward the Meridian building where Patricia Hawkins and James Morrison were waiting to sign contracts that would transform their companies and generate over $47 million in advisory fees. Fees that Marcus assumed would flow to Blackstone, despite having just eliminated the person who had built the entire transaction from scratch. David, I've been ready for this moment since we first talked in Washington. Make the call to our legal team. I'm about to demonstrate why you should never underestimate a former intelligence officer who spent 6 months building relationships that run deeper than corporate hierarchy. The security guard at Meridian recognized me immediately. Good morning, Captain. Mrs. Hawkins and Mr. Morrison are waiting in the executive conference room. He handed me the visitor badge that would grant me access to the 40th floor, having no idea that I was no longer employed by the company listed on my business card. I rode the elevator up, thinking about the USB drive in my briefcase that contained every document, analysis, and strategic recommendation I'd developed over 27 months of work. Marcus had fired me, but he'd forgotten one critical detail. I owned the relationships. I understood the deal structure better than anyone else in the industry, and I had a new firm ready to execute the transaction under terms that would make this the most expensive termination text message in corporate history. The elevator doors opened on the 40th floor, and I stepped into what would become the first day of Marcus Webb's worst nightmare, and the foundation of my own empire. Think this story resonates with your own experiences of being underestimated or betrayed? You're not alone. Subscribe to hear more stories about turning professional setbacks into strategic victories, and hit that notification bell, because the best revenge isn't getting even. It's building something so successful that your former boss has to watch you win from the sidelines.